Welcome to Crime Era Channel, where every crime tells a story. The darkest secrets of crime are uncovered, and the hidden truths of criminal underworlds come to light.
Across the latter half of the 20th century, the world seemed increasingly chaotic, fractured, and unpredictable. Political unrest, social upheaval, and a growing distrust of institutions left many searching for certainty in an uncertain era. Vietnam, civil rights battles, economic crises, and scandals created fertile ground for voices that promised clarity, purpose, and salvation. It was a time when ordinary people felt extraordinary vulnerability, and when that vulnerability met charisma, it became a dangerous mixture. Into this void stepped men who could command attention with the ease of a preacher and the precision of a strategist. Jim Jones and David Koresh were separated by geography and theology, yet united by a singular ability. They could identify the hidden anxieties of those around them and transform those fears into devotion. Their appeal was not merely religious, it was psychological, sociological, and intensely personal. They offered not just doctrine, but a framework for understanding a chaotic world and a promise of belonging in an exclusive, tightly knit community. Jones and Koresh built more than congregations, they built controlled microcosms in which every aspect of life reinforced the leader's authority. Followers were not simply believers, they became participants in an ideological ecosystem where obedience was the currency of survival and questioning was treated as both a moral and existential threat. To enter these worlds was to trade autonomy for certainty, freedom for community, and sometimes even life itself for promise. The human need for purpose and belonging, present in every culture and every era, became the lever these men used to consolidate power. Those who arrived seeking guidance found answers, routines, and structure, but also rules that bound them invisibly, restricting thought and action, reshaping morality, and bending loyalty toward the leader's will. Fear of loss, whether of paradise, community, or salvation, became a psychological chain, tightening invisibly around the hearts and minds of followers. This chapter does not yet speak of death, sieges, or poison. It speaks first of the conditions that make people vulnerable to domination, of the psychic and societal pressures that cultivate extreme loyalty, and of the delicate moment when faith becomes submission. To understand how Jones and Koresh orchestrated tragedies, one must first understand the hunger, isolation, and longing that preceded them. The seeds of obsession planted in the hearts of ordinary people, waiting for the right hand to nurture them. Fade out. A soft, distant echo of wind, a heartbeat. The stage is set.
A distant murmur of wind. Calm, reflective voiceover begins. Jim Jones arrived in the public consciousness as a preacher of hope. Born in rural Indiana, he grew up witnessing poverty, inequality, and social injustice. Early experiences shaped a charismatic, persuasive personality, driven by both genuine concern for the marginalized and an insatiable hunger for control. By the late 1950s, he had founded the People's Temple, a church that combined Christian teaching with socialist ideals, racial integration, and social outreach. To outsiders, Jones appeared revolutionary, a man reshaping faith into a tool for equality and inclusion. The People's Temple initially drew those who had been excluded, African Americans seeking social equality, the working class longing for community, and the disenfranchised hungry for guidance. Jones's sermons preached love, inclusion, and justice, while simultaneously emphasizing loyalty to himself. His magnetic charisma allowed him to cultivate both admiration and unquestioning obedience. The line between spiritual leadership and authoritarian control blurred with each sermon, each community initiative, each promise of paradise. Behind the public facade, Jones's methods of control began to crystallize. Surveillance was introduced under the guise of communal care. Personal confessions became tools of manipulation. Followers were encouraged to monitor one another, report disloyalty, and internalize guilt as a mechanism of obedience. Dissent was labeled betrayal, and the outside world was consistently painted as a threat to their utopia. Praise and fear became two sides of the same coin. Members who excelled in devotion were rewarded. Those who questioned were isolated, shamed, or coerced. As the movement expanded to California, the People's Temple grew into a sprawling social machine. Housing, jobs, relationships, and finances were all mediated through the church. While social programs, medical care, and activism garnered attention and respect, Jones's psychological control deepened. Communities lived in a paradox, nurtured by what seemed benevolence, yet restrained by invisible chains. Jones's vision was always utopian, but his methods increasingly mirrored tyranny. The seeds of Jonestown, the ultimate expression of his idealism twisted by fear and ego, were planted in these early years. By combining ideology, charisma, and psychological manipulation, he had created a community ready to surrender every aspect of life to his authority. And as the leader's power grew, so did the distance between his public image and the dark reality behind the scenes.
Through dry Texas brush, sparse, tense, ambient hum, voiceover begins. Unyielding in its vertical interpretation. His charisma was subtle but undeniable, a quiet pull that drew followers into his orbit. Unlike Jim Jones, his power emanated from overt social activism and promises of earthly paradise. Koresh's authority was framed through prophecy and meticulous scriptural exegesis. He presented himself as a divinely appointed messenger for the end of days. Koresh's early life was marked by instability and longing, a childhood of to reinterpret its prophecies, convincing followers that the apocalypse was imminent and that he alone possessed the keys to salvation. The group, already inclined toward esoteric teachings, found in Koresh a leader whose intellect and certainty inspired unwavering devotion. The Branch Davidian compound near Waco, Texas, became both sanctuary and stage for Koresh's vision. Followers lived under strict rules: curfews, weapons training, communal labor, and unwavering adherence to doctrine. Koresh established himself not only as teacher, but as ultimate arbiter of morality and survival. He blended spiritual authority with psychological influence, demanding absolute loyalty while presenting obedience as a sacred act. Personal desires and independent thought were subordinated to the apocalyptic mission. Children, adults, and elders alike became immersed in a world where the boundary between faith and fear blurred. Koresh's doctrines extended beyond simple belief. He taught that the end times were not distant, they were imminent. Resistance to his authority, or even casual doubt, was framed as defiance against God's plan. The compound's isolation, combined with armed preparation and strict ritual, ensured that the community's entire identity revolved around Koresh's interpretation of prophecy. To leave, or to question, was to risk both physical and spiritual annihilation. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Koresh had transformed the Branch Davidian community into a self-contained universe of belief, discipline, and preparation for catastrophe. Every member's life was intertwined with the leader's vision, a vision that promised transcendence, yet held the seeds of destruction. In Koresh's world, apocalypse was not metaphor, it was inevitable, and he alone could guide his followers through it.
Fade out. A soft echo of desert wind, distant and haunting. Both Jim Jones and David Koresh sought to create worlds apart from the chaos of mainstream society, utopias insulated from interference, judgment, and doubt. For Jones, this world was the dense, humid jungles of Guyana. For Koresh, it was a fortified compound in the arid expanse outside Waco, Texas. The environments differed, lush wilderness versus dusty desert, but their function was identical: to isolate followers physically and psychologically, to create a space where the leader's vision could go unchallenged and where obedience could be fully enforced. Jonestown was a sprawling experiment in collective idealism. Hundreds of followers toiled in communal labor, cleared brush, planted crops, and built cabins. Jones promised a socialist paradise, a place free of racism, capitalism, and corruption. Families arrived with hope, seeking refuge and purpose. Yet the isolation also enabled control. Surveillance became normalized, dissent was punished, and the outside world was cast as a relentless enemy. The jungle itself became a silent accomplice, shielding Jones from scrutiny and binding followers to the community. In Waco, the Branch Davidian compound achieved similar ends through architecture and ritual rather than topography. High fences, armed guards, and restricted access turned the property into a fortress. Inside, followers adhered to Koresh's precise interpretations of scripture, maintained daily routines, and trained for an impending apocalyptic confrontation. Isolation was not only physical, but ideological. The outside world was consistently depicted as corrupt, hostile, and unworthy of trust. Devotion to Koresh became the ultimate measure of faith. Despite differences in scale and geography, both communities cultivated intense cohesion. Social activities, communal labor, religious rituals, and shared ideology reinforced obedience and minimized independent thought. Members internalized the leader's authority as absolute, allowing them to carry out actions that, outside the compound, would seem unimaginable. The structures of isolation, physical, psychological, and social, created environments where fear, faith, and loyalty became indistinguishable. Yet in both cases, paradise and prison were intertwined. Followers were nourished, protected, and made to feel chosen, while simultaneously constrained, monitored, and manipulated. The utopias were carefully constructed mirrors of their leaders' minds, hopeful on the surface, but holding the seeds of eventual catastrophe. In understanding these isolated worlds, one sees how environment, authority, and ideology combine to shape behavior, how ordinary humans became capable of extraordinary obedience even in the shadow of death. Fade out. Soft, layered hum of jungle and desert wind, tension unresolved.
In the isolated worlds of Jonestown and Waco, ideology evolved from guidance into something far more lethal. Both Jim Jones and David Koresh wove doctrines that intertwined faith with the possibility, indeed the expectation, of death. For outsiders, these teachings appeared incomprehensible. Yet to those within, they were logical extensions of the leader's vision. The promise of paradise came with a price: absolute obedience, and in extreme cases, the surrender of life itself. Jones framed revolutionary suicide as a final act of defiance against a hostile world. In his rhetoric, the United States government and outside critics were not merely inconvenient, they were existential threats poised to destroy his utopia. Death, when directed and communal, became a statement of loyalty, an expression of moral righteousness, and a way to escape perceived persecution. Children and adults alike were taught to trust him implicitly, to embrace the notion that death was not defeat, but the final affirmation of faith. The doctrine normalized fear, turning it into a mechanism of control, and ultimately into instruments of murder disguised as salvation. Koresh's teachings operated differently, but with similar fatal potential. Drawing heavily on the Book of Revelation, he convinced followers that the apocalypse was imminent, that divine judgment was unavoidable, and that only those aligned with him could survive spiritually and metaphysically. While he did not initially advocate mass suicide, Koresh's insistence on armed preparation, extreme obedience, and absolute loyalty created a community poised to endure or embrace catastrophe as a sacred duty. Life outside the compound was presented as corrupt and meaningless. Life inside, however, dangerous, became the only path to salvation. Both doctrines demonstrate a chilling principle. When authority, ideology, and isolation converge, death can become a rationalized outcome. Followers were conditioned to see mortality not as an end, but a gateway to utopia, to divine favor, or to moral vindication. The psychological calculus was clear. The act of dying for the community or the prophecy was framed as transcendent, noble, and necessary. These fatal doctrines were not accidents. They were the culmination of decades of manipulation, isolation, and psychological pressure. They reveal the terrifying power of belief when guided by charismatic authority, and the tragic extent to which humans can relinquish agency in pursuit of purpose. Within the worlds of Jones and Koresh, death was no longer simply a risk. It was the ultimate instrument of control, the final affirmation of faith, and the final chapter of obedience. Fade out. A low, sustained drone mingling with distant wind. Silence lingers.
Wind rustling through jungle leaves and desert scrub. Low ambient hum. Voiceover, calm, tense, foreboding. Every isolated utopia faces external pressures, and for Jonestown and Waco, these pressures became catalysts for disaster. Leaders who once seemed untouchable suddenly confronted forces they could not fully control. For Jim Jones, it was government scrutiny, media intrusion, and growing dissent within his ranks. For David Koresh, it was law enforcement, federal agencies, and the intensifying attention of a nation unaccustomed to armed religious sects. Both communities were insulated, yet not impervious, and the resulting tension magnified the vulnerabilities inherent in their doctrines. In Jonestown, the arrival of Congressman Leo Ryan in November 1978 exposed the fragility beneath the veneer of utopia. Ryan's inquiry was not just a political visit, it was a direct challenge to Jones's authority. As outsiders spoke with temple members, some expressed a desire to leave, whispering fears long suppressed. Jones's paranoia escalated. The same psychological levers that had maintained obedience, fear, loyalty, isolation, were now weaponized to extreme effect. The perceived external threat made mass suicide seem, in Jones's mind, not only justified, but urgent. At Waco, pressure accumulated more gradually, yet with equal intensity. Federal agents, the ATF, and later the FBI, investigated the Branch Davidian compound for alleged weapons violations. Media coverage sensationalized the group's activities, amplifying tension. Koresh interpreted these intrusions as evidence of biblical prophecy. The apocalypse was imminent, the world hostile, and divine judgment imminent. His followers, already deeply loyal, absorbed the growing fear, further cementing the psychological grip he held over them. Every external inquiry reinforced the idea that survival and salvation depended solely on obedience. Internal pressures compounded the problem. In both communities, dissent and doubt were never tolerated for long. Whispers of discontent were swiftly suppressed, sometimes through coercion, sometimes through isolation. Leaders monitored loyalties meticulously, ensuring that fear, hope, and ideological certainty reinforced the same conclusion. The world outside was an enemy, and only submission within the compound could ensure safety, or deliverance. These pressure points created a perfect storm. External scrutiny validated internal paranoia. Legal threats, media attention, and the possibility of escape collided with decades of indoctrination. Ordinary humans, conditioned to fear and obey, were now facing what felt like existential threats. The mechanisms that had maintained control became accelerants for disaster. In both Jonestown and Waco, the stage was set. The utopias had reached the limit of external tolerance and internal control. The next chapter would not be a question of ideology or doctrine. It would be a question of survival, obedience, and the deadly consequences of faith pushed to its extremes. Fade out. Ominous hum with wind. Silence stretches. The final hours of Jonestown and Waco unfolded with a grim inevitability. For both communities, obedience had been absolute, and now faith would collide with mortality. What began as utopia had become a crucible, testing the limits of loyalty, fear, and devotion. The leader's vision, once abstract, now demanded its ultimate fulfillment, surrendering life to preserve ideology. In Jonestown, November 18, 1978 became the darkest day. The assassination of Congressman Leo Ryan and others at the nearby airstrip was the trigger, a violent confirmation of Jones's warnings. Inside the pavilion, Jones delivered his final directive: revolutionary suicide. Parents were called to administer poison to their children first, the ritual framed as salvation rather than death. Some members complied willingly, others were coerced, unable to resist the weight of authority and communal pressure. The poison, combined with sedatives, spread swiftly. The once bustling settlement fell silent, the jungle absorbing the collective tragedy. Fear, loyalty, and indoctrination merged into a single fatal act. At Waco, the final orders were framed differently, yet the outcome was similarly devastating. The 51-day standoff between Koresh's followers and federal authorities had escalated tensions to the breaking point. On April 19, 1993, a fire consumed the Branch Davidian compound. While the exact cause remains disputed, Koresh had prepared his followers for death as a form of divine fulfillment. The compound's flames became both literal and symbolic. Destruction intertwined with prophecy. Followers remained inside, convinced that their end was preordained and that surrendering to fire was a sacred act, a passage to salvation rather than defeat. In both cases, the final orders reflected the culmination of years of psychological conditioning, isolation, and ideological manipulation. In Jonestown, coercion and fear compelled participation. In Waco, belief and apocalyptic conviction enabled voluntary submission. Chaos versus ritual, force versus faith, but in each, the leader's word became absolute, and individual will was extinguished alongside the community's physical existence. These moments are haunting not only for their scale, but for the chilling clarity with which authority dictated life and death. The final orders reveal a universal truth about human vulnerability. When devotion, fear, and ideology converge under a charismatic leader, ordinary people can be compelled to commit acts that defy comprehension. In the shadows of Jonestown and Waco, obedience became deadly, and paradise promised by a leader became a trap from which there was no return. Fade out. Silence. Distant wind. The world outside seems impossibly far away.
The world outside Jonestown and Waco awoke to shock and disbelief. In Guyana, the jungle bore witness to the deaths of over 900 people, children, adults, families, entwined in a tragedy orchestrated by a single leader. News footage captured the surreal horror. Bodies sprawled beneath the tropical canopy, parents clutching children, the community erased in hours. Survivors carried guilt, grief, and haunting memories that would never fade. The public struggled to comprehend how ordinary people could be led to mass suicide or forced participation in murder disguised as salvation. At Waco, the aftermath was equally devastating, though different in nature. The fire that consumed the Branch Davidian compound left 76 dead, including Koresh. Media coverage painted images of a bizarre, apocalyptic sect,
Yet behind the headlines lay survivors traumatized by both ideology and the siege. Families mourned loved ones, while society wrestled with questions of law enforcement overreach, religious freedom, and the power of belief. Unlike Jonestown, Waco had a federal presence, but the end was no less tragic. Both events forced a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human nature. Experts and scholars dissected the psychological mechanisms at work: absolute authority, isolation, fear, ideological control, and the human yearning for belonging and purpose. Jonestown demonstrated the extreme danger of coercive leadership, while Waco revealed how belief, when entwined with apocalyptic ideology, could compel voluntary surrender even in the face of evident peril. The mechanisms differed, but the outcome, devastation, was the same. Survivors, investigators, and society at large grappled with lingering questions. How could trust be weaponized? How could devotion override instinct? How could hope be manipulated into destruction? Both tragedies became case studies in the dark potential of faith under the influence of a charismatic, authoritarian figure. These events also left enduring legacies. Jonestown reshaped approaches to cult intervention, government oversight, and public awareness of manipulative religious movements. Waco influenced law enforcement tactics, media scrutiny, and discussions on religious freedom versus public safety. Yet beyond policies and headlines, the human cost remained: the irreparable loss of life, shattered communities, and the enduring shadow of obedience taken to its lethal extreme. In the silence following these events, one truth resonates: when ideology, authority, and fear converge, ordinary individuals can be led into extraordinary, irreversible tragedy. And in that echo, the world is reminded of the fragile boundary between faith and fatal surrender. Jonestown and Waco, though separated by geography, culture, and theology, reveal a strikingly similar anatomy of leadership, a blueprint for devotion and destruction. In studying Jim Jones and David Koresh, patterns emerge that explain not only how followers were controlled, but why ordinary humans surrendered autonomy, critical thinking, and ultimately life itself. These patterns are subtle yet universal: charisma, isolation, absolutism, and the manipulation of hope and fear. Charisma is the first and most potent tool. Both Jones and Koresh possess the ability to command attention, evoke trust, and present certainty in an uncertain world. Their followers perceived them as visionaries, messengers, or saviors, capable of interpreting life's chaos and providing meaning. This magnetism allowed leaders to bypass skepticism, cultivating devotion not through argument, but through presence, persuasion, and psychological gravitas. Isolation amplified control. Physical separation, from the jungle in Guyana to a fenced compound in Waco, created environments in which leaders' narratives went unchallenged. Psychological isolation reinforced obedience. Communication with the outside world was restricted, dissent discouraged, and ideology became the lens through which all reality was interpreted. Followers were not merely controlled, they were conditioned to see the world as the leader described it. Absolutism in doctrine ensured compliance. Jones framed revolutionary suicide as salvation. Koresh portrayed apocalyptic obedience as divine duty. Questioning authority was equated with spiritual failure, betrayal, or moral weakness. By positioning themselves as the ultimate arbiters of truth, these leaders removed choice from followers' lives. Decisions, moral, practical, even life and death, were dictated by a singular will.
Finally, the manipulation of hope and fear was pervasive. Followers were promised paradise, survival, or divine favor, yet conditioned to fear outsiders, betrayal, or existential catastrophe. This duality created psychological tension, binding the community together and reinforcing obedience. Hope became incentive, fear became restraint. Together, they produced a profound dependency on the leader's guidance. These patterns are not accidents. They're the product of decades of study, observation, and instinctual understanding of human psychology. Followers, driven by the desire for meaning, belonging, and protection, were rendered susceptible to extremes of authority. Jonestown and Waco illustrate that when charisma, isolation, doctrinal absolutism, and emotional manipulation converge, ordinary individuals can be led to acts that defy comprehension. The tragedies are not merely historical curiosities, they are mirrors. They reflect human vulnerability, the fragility of judgment under pressure, and the enduring power of belief when wielded by the wrong hands. Studying these patterns is not just about understanding the past, it is a warning for the future. Fade out. Wind whispers. Distant hum persists. Silence hangs.
Dark sky, faint wind, slow, reflective ambient hum, voiceover, calm, solemn, haunting. Jonestown and Waco, separated by years, geography, and doctrine, converge in their ultimate lesson, the deadly cost of absolute faith in flawed authority. Both tragedies reveal the fragile intersection of human desire, devotion, and vulnerability, a convergence where hope, fear, and ideology can override reason, instinct, and the will to survive. These events demonstrate that the human need for belonging and purpose is universal, yet profoundly exploitable. Ordinary individuals sought guidance, community, and meaning, and found in Jones and Koresh leaders who could articulate their longings. The promises were seductive: paradise, salvation, or protection from a hostile world. In return, followers relinquished autonomy, subordinated judgment, and ultimately entrusted their lives to a single person's vision. Jonestown illustrates the catastrophic effect of coercion and fear. Revolutionary suicide, mandated by Jones, forced participation, weaponized obedience, and normalized the idea that death could be morally righteous. Waco, by contrast, demonstrates the subtle yet equally lethal effect of long-term indoctrination. Koresh did not compel death through immediate violence. He cultivated unwavering loyalty through scripture, ritual, and apocalyptic vision, creating followers willing to embrace destruction as divine fulfillment. Both tragedies underscore the dangerous potency of isolation and absolute authority. Whether through the physical remoteness of the Guyanese jungle or the fortified compound in Texas, leaders created microcosms impervious to outside intervention. Within these spaces, ideological control, fear of punishment, and hope of salvation intertwined, producing communities capable of extraordinary obedience. The lessons extend beyond these historical events. They challenge society to confront the vulnerabilities inherent in human nature, the craving for certainty, the hunger for belonging, and the susceptibility to charismatic authority. They remind us that devotion, when manipulated, can become a conduit for tragedy. They compel reflection on the structures of influence we accept, the figures we trust implicitly, and the ideologies we embrace without scrutiny. In the silence left by Jonestown and Waco, one truth resonates: belief is powerful, and obedience can be deadly. When absolute faith meets absolute authority, ordinary humans can be led to extraordinary acts of loyalty, courage, or destruction. And in that shadow, the story of these communities serves not only as a warning, but as a mirror, a reflection of hope, fear, and the perilous edge between faith and fatal surrender. Fade to black. Wind rises softly. silence.
Thank you for stopping by at Crime Era channel. We hope you enjoyed your time here. Ensure you like and subscribe to our channel so you get notified each time we uncover another hidden crime story. Don't forget to share so your friends and family so they too can know the hidden truth.